We were told that America was leading the electric vehicle revolution, but that turned out to be false. Virtually overnight, Germany, France, and Denmark didn't just respond. They buried the US auto industry. This isn't just a trade disagreement. It's a deliberate, coordinated economic offensive aimed directly at what the US believed it dominated, the future of the automobile. While the headlines focused on tariffs, Berlin took decisive action. American EVs were banned from government, contracts, subsidies were withdrawn, and dealerships began clearing out US-made cars. Then came the real blow. Germany wasn't acting alone. France followed, then Denmark, and now the American auto sector is in free fall. The big question is why Europe turned its back on Tesla, Ford, and General Motors. Are there secret deals being made behind America's back? And where does Elon Musk fit into all of this? This goes far beyond just cars. The $110 billion tariff decision was just the start. France didn't merely support Germany. They took it further, launching a full-scale economic offensive. Within days of Germany's fleet ban, the French government imposed an unprecedented 25% tariff on all US automobile imports. This wasn't a threat or a negotiation tactic. It became law. The announcement sent shockwaves through Detroit, where GM and Ford executives scrambled to comprehend the scope of the crisis. France had long been a key market for American cars, and now it was effectively closed. But Paris wasn't done yet. In a coordinated press event, President Emmanuel Macron unveiled a new strategic alliance with Renault and Stellantis. France announced it would redirect all federal and municipal contracts to domestic automakers, and more significantly, pledged massive subsidies and public investments to ensure that European electric vehicles would replace American imports entirely on French roads. The political messaging was sharp and strategic. France wasn't just retaliating, it was defending European jobs. This narrative quickly gained traction across French media, framing American EVs as a threat to Europe's economics, sovereignty. Within days, public opinion shifted noticeably, with polls showing a steep drop in consumer interest toward American automotive brands. While Germany and France applied economic pressure, Denmark's approach was far more targeted and personal. Instead of addressing the entire US auto industry, Denmark set its sights on a single company and its polarizing CEO. Tesla wasn't just blacklisted. Elon Musk was painted as the new villain of Europe. The Danish Financial Supervisory Authority made a decisive move. Two of the country's largest pension funds, Akademiker Pension and Pension Denmark, announced immediate divestment from Tesla. They cited ethical concerns, including labor disputes, violations of UN principles, and political entanglements. Tesla was officially designated as an excluded entity. Denmark's Trade and Industry Ministry then followed with a policy shift that hit consumers directly. EV rebate programs were revised to exclude any electric vehicles manufactured by American companies. Overnight, the cost of buying a Tesla or a GM EV skyrocketed compared to European models, effectively pricing American brands out of the Danish market. Local media outlets reinforced the message, portraying the move as a defense against foreign political influence. Headlines labeled Tesla a symbol of American hegemony, while commentators linked Musk to far-right European parties and his association with former President Trump as a direct challenge to European democratic values. The civic backlash came quickly. Tesla dealerships in Denmark were flooded with cancellations, and online forums were filled with angry posts calling for a total boycott of American-made vehicles. But this wasn't just about European retaliation anymore. The entire US auto industry was suddenly facing a crisis. What began with tariffs had erupted into a full-blown trade disaster. By the time Denmark's blacklist took effect, economists were already raising red flags. A detailed report from the International Trade Council revealed that the coordinated actions by Germany, France, and Denmark had put over $219 billion and $500 million in American automobile exports at direct risk. The numbers were staggering. In the previous year alone, U.S. automakers had shipped more than $110 billion worth of vehicles to Europe. Now those exports were under siege, slapped with 25% tariffs, wiped out of fleet contracts, and stripped of consumer incentives. For Ford, General Motors, and Tesla, this wasn't a minor setback. It was an existential threat, The consequences hit fast. Within weeks, General Motors projected a $14 billion revenue loss. Ford estimated $6 billion. Tesla's market valuation nosedived as European pension funds dumped shares and customers abandoned the brand. But the damage didn't stop at Wall Street. On the ground in states like Michigan and Ohio, factory managers announced waves of layoffs. Supply chain issues caused temporary plant closures across Illinois, Kentucky, and Indiana. Auto parts suppliers, many of them small, family-run businesses, began filing for bankruptcy at an alarming pace. Dealerships, already strained by inflation and rising costs, were overwhelmed by a flood of cancelled orders. Consumer confidence collapsed, especially in rural towns where manufacturing jobs are the backbone of local economies. Panic started to spread. Community leaders warned that what was unfolding could rival the economic collapse of 2008. And just as the industry scrambled to contain the fallout, President Trump made it clear he had no intention of backing down. In fact, he was preparing to escalate the conflict even further. Trump's economic offensive was pitched as a bold move to protect American jobs, but it quickly turned into a self-inflicted crisis. What was supposed to be a show of strength became an economic shockwave that tore through the U.S. auto industry. When the Trump administration rolled out sweeping tariffs on foreign-made vehicles and auto parts, the message was clear. Punish countries that, in Trump's words, had taken advantage of the American market and bring manufacturing back home. But instead of stability, the industry was thrown into chaos. At the center of the storm was a 25% tariff on imported vehicles and components from the European Union. On February 20, 2025, Trump signed an executive order citing national security concerns under the Trade Expansion Act of 1962. The move, specifically, targeted Germany, France, and Denmark, nations he blamed for gutting U.S. manufacturing. But the fallout landed squarely on American soil. Automakers like Ford, General Motors, and Stellantis had long relied on European supply chains to source transmissions, batteries, and cutting-edge electronics. With one stroke of the pen, those essential parts became 20% more expensive, forcing companies to either raise vehicle prices or absorb massive financial losses. Ford warned that the cost of some of their most affordable models could surge by up to $6,000 per car. The response from Europe was swift. Germany, France, and Denmark filed a formal complaint with the World Trade Organization, arguing that the tariffs were illegal and retaliatory. But while the legal process crawled through the diplomatic system, a much faster and more targeted counterstrike was already taking shape. This time from north of the border. Canada launched its own economic retaliation, and it was aimed squarely at Tesla. In March 2025, the Canadian government, led by the National Democratic Party and backed by key provincial leaders, unveiled a direct strike against the U.S.'s most high-profile EV brand. Lawmakers proposed a $10,000 tariff on every SUV Tesla imported into Canada, but they didn't stop there. In a move designed to shift consumer loyalty, Canada rolled out an aggressive rebate program, offering a $10,000 incentive exclusively for electric vehicles made within Canadian borders. The message was unambiguous. Buy local or pay the price. Elon Musk, once hailed as a global innovator, was now becoming a political flashpoint across multiple borders. The economic war had gone international, and it was no longer just about trade. Any vehicle with American origins, including those from Tesla, Ford, and General Motors, was deliberately excluded from Canada's new incentive programs. The government also removed Tesla from all federal grant eligibility, effectively cutting the company off from green technology subsidies. Overnight, Tesla's prices in Canada surged, while Canadian-made vehicles and local brands became significantly more affordable and appealing. The political message was crystal clear. Trump's tariffs wouldn't go unanswered, and Canada would defend its own auto industry, even if it meant targeting America's biggest car makers. Elon Musk's public alignment with Trump only added fuel to the fire. As tensions escalated, Tesla became a lightning rod for Canadian outrage, symbolizing not innovation, but foreign interference and political overreach. Yet the fallout wasn't just international. It was turning catastrophic at home, especially in the very regions that had once formed the backbone of Trump's support. In Trump's heartland, the economic collapse hit hardest. Across the Midwest, And rural America, where the auto industry had sustained families and communities for generations, Trump's protectionist promises were unraveling. By mid-2025, those promises lay in tatters. Factory shutdowns swept through Michigan, Ohio, and Illinois. Ford announced the closure of 2 major plants, slashing over 15,000 jobs. General Motors followed with 12,000 layoffs, many in counties that had voted overwhelmingly for Trump. In Indiana, a critical link in the supply chain crumbled when the flow of European auto parts was severed by tariffs, forcing small manufacturers into bankruptcy. The reaction was immediate. In Michigan and Ohio, the United Auto Workers Union launched massive protests, blocking highways and demanding a reversal of Trump's trade policies. Rural communities that had rallied around America First were now grappling with unemployment, lost health care, and economic despair. Just as the human toll became impossible to ignore, the financial markets delivered a devastating verdict. Wall Street's confidence in the American auto industry collapsed in real time. In one brutal week, $219.5 billion in market value evaporated. The Dow Jones plunged 800 points in a single day, while the S&P 500 and NASDAQ both fell more than 2%, signaling a major correction. The automotive sector bore the brunt of the collapse. Tesla's valuation plunged from $770 billion to $635 billion, wiping out $135 billion in shareholder value. General Motors and Ford faced projected losses of $14 billion and $6 billion respectively, as analysts downgraded earnings and investors dumped shares. The shockwaves extended into retirement accounts, pension funds, and local economies, tethered to the health of the auto industry. Trump had promised to revive American manufacturing, but instead his policies triggered an economic tailspin that left workers abandoned, markets rattled, and an entire industry teetering on the edge. Small investors, factory workers, and everyday Americans watched helplessly as the value of their savings and livelihoods vanished. The American dream, so closely intertwined with car culture and the pride of manufacturing, was being dismantled before their eyes. But Europe's retaliation wasn't just about tariffs or trade disputes. Beneath the surface, a much larger and more dangerous strategy was unfolding. A calculated shift in global power. And as the dust settled on Wall Street, that power play was only beginning. While U.S. automakers struggled under the weight of economic blowback, Europe quietly constructed something far more ambitious, an electric vehicle empire that intentionally left America out. It didn't begin with fiery speeches or dramatic announcements, but with carefully written legislation. In early 2025, Germany, France, and Denmark signed a series of sweeping agreements under the European Green Mobility Acceleration Act. Though framed as an environmental initiative, the policy was precise and unapologetic. To qualify for public subsidies, any EV sold within the EU had to be manufactured inside the bloc and meet strict sustainability benchmarks. In effect, American automakers were locked out. The announcement sent shockwaves through Detroit, Silicon Valley, and Washington, but in Europe, it was hailed as long overdue. European leaders cast the move not as retaliation, but as a defense of sovereignty and innovation, a strategic pivot away from American dominance. As the policy took hold, European automakers flourished. In France, Renault's EV lineup outsold all foreign brands combined. Volkswagen overtook Tesla in Germany for the first time since 2019. In Denmark, where American EVs once lined the streets, consumers began overwhelmingly choosing European models, driven by both patriotism and substantial tax incentives. But this wasn't just about policy. It was about values. While U.S. companies were locked in labor disputes and chasing short-term stock performance, European manufacturers were investing in sustainability, working with unions, and reinvesting in their communities. The contrast was sharp and European. Consumers noticed. One Brussels official put it bluntly: American EVs may have the tech, but Europe has the soul. With that mindset, Europe didn't just compete. They closed the door. Billions in U.S. EV exports evaporated, not because of trade bans, but because Europe decided its future wouldn't include the United States. At the center of that collapse stood Elon Musk, once the face of innovation, now a cautionary tale of politics and hubris. Musk, once celebrated as the man who made electric cars cool, had become a liability. In Germany, his public praise for the far-right Alternative for Germany party ignited immediate backlash. The group's anti-immigrant rhetoric and climate change denial made Musk's support deeply controversial. German media branded him a provocateur, and protesters defaced Tesla showrooms with signs reading, "No fascism with our future." In France, Musk's vocal support for Donald Trump and defense of the escalating trade war turned Tesla into a symbol of betrayal. With jobs vanishing in the French auto sector due to US tariffs, Musk's remarks were seen as tone-deaf at best and incendiary at worst. Public trust in Tesla collapsed. Then Denmark responded. The government stripped Tesla of its eligibility for federal EV grants, but it was the public response that really stood out. Citizens organized a national petition to revoke Musk's honorary economic status, a rare designation reserved for major foreign investors. Thousands signed, sending a clear message: Tesla no longer stood for innovation. It stood for American arrogance. Musk's personal brand had always been inseparable from Tesla's. But now that brand was radioactive. Sales across Europe tanked. Major pension funds blacklisted Tesla stock. Media outlets stopped calling the company by its name, opting instead for headlines like "Musk's collapse continues" and "Can the company survive its founder?" Even Musk's Canadian connections came under scrutiny. Lawmakers in Ottawa debated whether Tesla should be stripped of its eligibility for Canada's Green Investment Fund, citing both political concerns and market distortion. A company once seen as the future of mobility was now mired in controversy, its global dominance under threat, not just from competitors, but from its own CEO. Musk's increasingly erratic presence on the global stage was no longer just a business liability. It had become a destabilizing force in international trade. Across Europe, Tesla stopped being seen as merely a car company. It had become a lightning rod for outrage, a political symbol of American overreach and corporate arrogance. And in this case, that symbol was hurtling straight off a cliff. But the economic collapse of America's auto sector was only the beginning. Europe's retaliation was never just about countering tariffs. It was about building the future. Quietly, behind the scenes, Germany, France, and Denmark weren't just reacting. They were laying the groundwork for a new kind of trade alliance, one that would exclude the United States altogether. In a dramatic pivot, the European Commission began exploring cross-border trade agreements with Canada and Mexico. These weren't deals aimed at improving access to the US market. Instead, they focused on strategically bypassing it. Under the new proposed framework, electric vehicles and auto parts could flow tariff-free between the European Union, Canada, and Mexico, so long as no US origin components were used. With Trump's 25% tariffs still in effect, the proposal gained momentum fast. Canada's Prime Minister and Mexico's Economic Minister flew to Brussels for back-to-back meetings with EU leaders. Topics ranged from supply chain realignment to green tech investment and the creation of localized EV manufacturing hubs. A leaked draft agreement revealed plans for joint development zones in Quebec and Bavaria, funded entirely without US participation. These zones would become future centers for zero-emission vehicle production, crafted from the ground up to exist independently of American industry. Meanwhile, the World Trade Organization convened an emergency session to address the escalating crisis after the US refused to withdraw its auto tariffs. But something unprecedented happened. America's traditional allies no longer stood with Washington. Instead, they aligned with each other. The global trade landscape was shifting from open globalization to what economists began calling strategic regionalism. In this new order, the United States was no longer seen as a stabilizing partner. It was viewed as an unpredictable wild card. At the very moment global cooperation was needed most, to curb inflation, stabilize supply chains, and rebuild trust, the US chose isolation. The White House doubled down on protectionism, and Europe, Canada, and Mexico simply moved on. But perhaps the most profound betrayal didn't come from abroad. It came from within. While the world scrambled to navigate trade shocks, Donald Trump signed a series of executive orders that stunned even his most loyal allies. And when the details emerged, they sent Washington into meltdown. The first, signed in March, invoked the rarely used Alien Enemies Act of 1798 to authorize the deportation of nearly 300 Venezuelan immigrants, labeling them economic extremists. Within 48 hours, the order was signed, published in the Federal Register, and executed. But then Trump publicly denied it ever happened. "I don't know when that was signed," he told reporters. "Other people handled it. The contradiction was explosive. His signature was on the order. His spokesperson confirmed it. Legal experts were alarmed. The act hadn't been used since Wallace, and never without a formal declaration of war." In a federal courtroom, a Department of Justice lawyer offered a chilling admission. "We were simply executing instructions. We weren't given full information." That statement sent shockwaves through the legal community. But the chaos didn't stop there. Days later, Trump signed a second, even more controversial series of executive actions, this time targeting American workers. The orders stripped workplace protections for federal contractors, eliminated wage, transparency requirements, and suspended collective bargaining rights at defense production sites. The backlash was immediate. Union leaders across the country condemned the move. Legal scholars warned that it represented a dangerous consolidation of executive power. For millions of American workers, it was confirmation that their president had turned against them. Then came the revelation that broke everything wide open. Leaked White House memos showed that several of the executive orders had been drafted not by public officials, but by outside consultants, including members of Elon Musk's private transition advisory group. The implications were staggering. Had the executive branch been quietly outsourced to billionaires? Were these policies crafted to protect Tesla and Starlink, even as they crushed labor rights and workplace protections? The political fallout was immediate and devastating. But the most explosive reaction came from the labor movement, and what followed would shake the foundation of American politics and the global economy alike. The labor revolt had begun. Unions declared war on Trump and on Musk. America's workers had finally had enough, and this time they weren't just marching. They were shaking the foundation of power itself. After months of watching their jobs disappear and their paychecks shrink, factory workers, port employees, and auto technicians erupted in protest. The trade war that was supposed to protect American labor had gutted it instead, and when Europe, led by Germany, France, and Denmark, slammed the door on U.S. auto exports, that was the breaking point. The first spark ignited in Detroit. The United Auto Workers declared a nationwide strike, one of the largest in modern U.S. history, not just over layoffs and pay cuts, but over what they called a systematic betrayal by Donald Trump's trade agenda. Within days, port workers from New Jersey to California walked out, shutting down critical shipping routes. It was a coordinated, defiant stand. American labor was done being collateral damage. But the shockwaves didn't stop at U.S. borders. In a historic move, labor unions across Europe joined the fight. German and French unions, typically wary of their American counterparts, announced a formal alliance with the UAW. They launched a joint boycott of U.S. auto brands, refusing to load or unload American-made vehicles in European ports. In Denmark, the movement intensified. Unions demanded the suspension of all government contracts with Tesla, until Elon Musk issued a public apology for his role in supporting Trump's policies. It was unprecedented. A transatlantic labor revolt, uniting against both corporate overreach and political manipulation. And while the workers fought in the streets and on the docks, the markets crumbled. The financial panic hit hard and fast. The morning after the UAW strike announcement, the Dow Jones plunged 780 points. The S&P 500 fell nearly 3%. The Nasdaq slipped by over 2.5%. But the real punch came when the dust settled. More than $3.6 trillion in global market value had vanished in just 48 hours. It wasn't just auto stocks. Banks, construction firms, tech giants, even commodities, all suffered. The collapse of the American auto industry sent classic recession signals flashing red. Bond yields dropped, consumer confidence sank to its lowest level since 2008, and supply chain-linked small businesses began closing overnight. Everyday Americans felt it immediately. Mortgage rates jumped. Grocery prices soared. Gas stations quietly raised prices as fuel imports got tangled in retaliatory tariffs. And as the economic pain spread, a darker question emerged, one no one wanted to ask. Had the American auto industry just passed the point of no return? The damage went deeper than quarterly losses. The U.S. auto industry had long stood on three pillars: mass production, global distribution, and consumer trust. By the time Europe's retaliation ran its course, all three were in ruins. Factory closures in Michigan, Ohio, and Illinois became permanent. Suppliers, especially small and mid-sized ones, filed for bankruptcy at record rates. Entire communities that had depended on car manufacturing for generations were left with nothing. No jobs, no pensions, no health care. And Wall Street made its decision. Investors began pulling out. Capital flowed into European and Asian markets, particularly Germany, China, and South Korea. Foreign direct investment surged abroad as confidence in American manufacturers collapsed. Consumer trust at home vanished too. Pew Research surveys revealed that over 65% of American consumers no longer trusted U.S. automakers to deliver reliable, affordable vehicles.